have returned to the Scholasticism series, a series that I began a while ago. In that first video, the Prolegomena, I titled the video Scholastic Terminology, but I think it's best to expand it to scholasticism in general, though we are going to focus primarily on metaphysics and the principles that flow from it, including certain principles of physics. This series will take a while to complete because it's very detailed, something I may even turn into a sort of book someday. But suffice it to say that I want to put in the greatest amount of work and effort possible into this series because I think it's very important and often neglected in Lutheran circles. With that being said, in this video I will give a summary of the various scholastic views of metaphysics as a science. Okay, so I kind of lied. Before we get into the definition of metaphysics, I want to briefly defend the use of Aristotle in this video. Anybody who knows the basics of scholasticism can tell you that Aristotle was highly influential to the scholastics, especially those figures in the peak era of scholasticism, the time of Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, John Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham. He was also influential on Lutheran thinkers like Philip Melanchthon, Martin Chemnitz, and Johann Gerhard. Did Luther oppose Aristotle in a lot of ways? Yes. He had a strong dislike for Aristotle in certain aspects. But we must recall that Luther was not simply targeting Aristotle, but the philosophical speculations of his era, as well as the false human conceptions of works that merit righteousness, both of which were grounded in Aristotelian ethics. Jordan Cooper and Dan Lioy write the following, quote, "It is important, however, to note in what sense Luther rejects the work of the philosopher. The first sense in which Luther rejects Aristotle is in the utilization of logical syllogism. For Luther, divine truth is to be accepted through revelation rather than through logical argumentation. He notes, for example, that such a use of logic as expositor of divine truth would negate even the dogma of the Trinity as a teaching of faith, instead placing it within the realm of natural reason. The second reason why Luther rejects Aristotle is the use of his ethical writings. The Reformer does not, however, reject Aristotle's ethical theory as such, but the imposition of virtue ethics into the category of justification coram Deo." End quote. Had Lutheranism stood in opposition to Aristotle in his entirety, we would not see Aristotelian thought piercing through the formula of Concord and later scholastic disputations from our greatest thinkers. Robert Preuss comments that Philip Melanchthon, quote, "admitted that Aristotle excelled in the philosophy of all other sects," end quote, and also writes the following in a footnote. Quote, "Melanchthon in no way desires to make Christian revelation correspond to Aristotelian or Platonic thought. The opposite is the case. In his philosophical works, he attempts to make Aristotle and others profitable by purging them by means of revelation. Thus, he will go along working out, for instance, a system of epistemology patterned quite obviously after Aristotelian empiricism and certain Stoic accretions." End quote. For more of this, I recommend Jordan Cooper's PhD thesis, as well as his summary paper titled "The Use of Classical Greek Philosophy in Early Lutheranism," which further demonstrates that Aristotelianism is compatible with Lutheranism. I say all of this because I can already see commenters asking me why I'm citing Aristotle in the Scholastics when it seems like Luther is opposed to them entirely. Now, I think we can turn to the definition of metaphysics. The definition of metaphysics is not as contentious as other questions in the domain of metaphysics for the scholastics. Aristotle defines metaphysics as the study of being qua being, which is to say that metaphysics studies being in itself. The term qua here simply means as, so we are saying that metaphysics studies being as being. Metaphysics, therefore, studies first principles, concepts that may seem very abstract and general to us, but are perfectly intelligible in themselves. That said, S. Mark Cohen argues that when Aristotle says that we study being as being, we are not studying being as a distant concrete mass, but we study beings insofar as they have being. To employ scholastic terminology, the material object of metaphysics is all things, but the formal object of metaphysics is being in itself. Let's define those terms, then circle back to our definition. According to Bernard Wellner, the material object is the, quote, "general or common subject matter, rather than a specialized feature of study or the specialized viewpoint under which the subject is studied," end quote. Meanwhile, the formal object is the, quote, "special, primary, immediate characteristic or aspect considered or sought in a material or whole object," end quote. That is to say that the material object is the subject being examined, and the formal object is the study under which we examine it. Think of it in terms of looking at a painting. You can focus on and consider the color of a painting, the shapes present, etc. In both considerations, the material object is the painting, but in one case, the formal object is the color, and in the other case, the formal object is geometry. So to summarize, the material object is the entire thing being examined in the study, while the formal object is the actual lens or subject that you are considering in the material object. Bonaventure is a fascinating figure in scholastic philosophy. He's really one of the last great Christian Platonists insofar as he leans on Plato more than he does Aristotle. In a lot of ways, he's a real Augustinian, at least philosophically. Unfortunately, he never wrote an introduction of metaphysics that we see in Aristotle, Aquinas, or others, but his system is nonetheless interesting because he influences the Franciscan tradition rather significantly, and he's a great philosopher in his own right. Though Bonaventure does not give us a definition of metaphysics, we can nonetheless see what he does in his metaphysical disputations. Bonaventure's discussions of metaphysics focus on God rather extensively because he is both the first efficient cause and the exemplar cause of all things. Bonaventure's metaphysics heavily emphasizes the concept of exemplar causality, which is a kind of formal causality. So we can conclude that Bonaventure's metaphysics considers first principles, and the primary first principle is God. This isn't to say that he's a pantheist, but that God is the model of all reality. To quote Bonaventure, quote, "This is the sum of my metaphysics. It consists in its entirety in emanation, exemplarity, and consummation, the spiritual radiations that enlighten the soul and leads it back to the highest reality." End quote. Aquinas is much more explicit concerning metaphysics than Bonaventure is, and I believe that much of this is because of his Aristotelian influence. Bonaventure never wrote commentaries on Aristotle, but Aquinas pours tons of ink into such works. And since Aristotle has an entire work devoted to metaphysics, one which includes the definition of metaphysics, we would expect that Aquinas would define metaphysics explicitly too. According to Thomas Aquinas, metaphysics is a speculative science, which is a science studied for its own sake. It's speculative not because it is arbitrary and has no intrinsic value, but because the knowledge that one gains in metaphysical study is valuable for its own sake. I clarify this because many are afraid to call something speculative. It simply comes down to different definitions. Similarly, science in the scholastic and Aristotelian sense is defined by Bernard Wellner as, quote, "the certain intellectual knowledge of something in its causes, universal, demonstrated, organized knowledge of facts and truth, and the reasons or causes of these," end quote. Modern thinkers restrict science to purely inductive sciences, which is why this definition may seem odd. Overall, metaphysics, according to Aquinas, is a speculative science, which Bernard Wellner defines as, quote, "a science concerned with the discovery of truth for truth's sake, i.e., for the sake of knowing." Aquinas echoes Aristotle in saying that metaphysics studies being qua being. This plays out somewhat differently in Aquinas because of his emphasis on the essence-existence distinction, something we don't see in Aristotle. This is really the heart of Thomistic metaphysics, the essence-existence distinction. This is the fundamental distinction in Thomism, and it finds its pinnacle in the Deante et Essentia, where he argues from this distinction to the existence of God. Of course, other distinctions like the act-potency distinction and form-matter distinction are important to Thomas, but the essence-existence distinction is absolutely key for him in a way that I don't think the others are. He may explain the essence-existence distinction in terms of act and potency, but he wouldn't say that act and potency are more fundamental, at least in my mind. We'll return to this later in another video, one that covers the debate over the nature of being in greater detail. But suffice it to say that Aquinas' metaphysics truly culminates in this distinction. Finally, note that he differs from Bonaventure insofar as he is immensely influenced by Aristotle, though we cannot certainly deny that he is somewhat influenced by Neoplatonic Augustinian ideas in terms of philosophy. Of course, he's heavily influenced by Augustine theologically. He and Bonaventure were great friends, in fact, and I would have loved to see their conversations in real time. Aristotle, Aquinas, and Scotus do not differ too much in their definition of metaphysics. He sees metaphysics as a real theoretical science, which is to say that it concerns realities rather than mere concepts, and is sought for its own sake. The term theoretical there can also be speculative, so he and Aquinas agree ultimately there. Again, he defines metaphysics as a study of being qua being, just as Aristotle and Aquinas do. What's interesting, though, is that Scotist metaphysics unfolds rather significantly into a theory of transcendentals used to categorize reality. Scotus has some fascinating contributions to the theory of transcendentals. Aquinas and others certainly admit that the transcendentals are important, but I find that Scotus and his followers put an emphasis on the transcendentals that distinguishes him from other scholastics. Ockham is a very important figure in scholasticism, though he admittedly is not well liked in traditionalist circles for a variety of reasons. Ockham is very different from his predecessors in a lot of ways. He follows a conceptualist line of thought, denying that certain metaphysical entities or subjects are anything beyond concepts in the mind. He's often labeled a nominalist, but I think this is a misnomer. Some people would even call him the destroyer of metaphysics because of his infamous razor, his fideism, and his conceptualism. I'm not going to go that far. I don't think that he was simply opposed to metaphysics on a conceptual level, but his positions were opposed to realism. I openly admit that I'm a realist, so I don't have much influence from Ockham in the realm of metaphysics, but I want to keep him in a positive light because I do think he was incredibly brilliant, even though I disagree. Like Bonaventure, he never wrote a commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics. I honestly wish he did. I think it would have been fascinating. What's interesting about Ockham is that he's not openly skeptical of metaphysics entirely, but the metaphysical conclusions of those before him. He's unlike Kant in that way. He makes metaphysical conclusions, but positions that I think are simply unpopular. His metaphysics is radically particular as opposed to universal, and he uses logic and language to dismiss a lot of entities that he deems unnecessary, which he would say violate his razor. I don't think we can easily classify his position on metaphysics, at least in its definition, but we can see that the character of his metaphysics is much different than previous thinkers. He's very fideist in his thought, questioning our ability to make metaphysical arguments for many positions of the Christian faith. There's a lot of work on him, much of it very negative, but he's an important figure for the history of philosophy and the history of the church in a variety of reasons, and I think there are some valuable things we can learn from him. Suarez believes that metaphysics concerns being insofar as it is real being, where real being includes both infinite being and finite being, substance and real accidents. What's key here is that he does not believe that beings of reason, which are basically just objects of thought, enter into metaphysical discussion. A being of reason is not merely a mental representation of an existing reality, but something that does not actually exist in the real world, but nonetheless serves as something valuable for us. Wellner defines a being of reason as, quote, a being that can only exist as an object of thought, but lacks potency for real existence, end quote. I like to think of the number zero as a good example. It's not a real thing in that you don't see nothing positively, but it reflects reality in a way nonetheless. He also includes privations in this category, like blindness, which I think is a great example as well. Unfortunately, the Lutherans do not have very specific metaphysical treatises or works defining metaphysics. That said, the Lutherans certainly engage in metaphysical disputations insofar as it befits theological ideas. They make arguments for the existence of God in light of metaphysical principles, and they describe God and his attributes in light of metaphysical, even scholastic concepts. I would return to those exact discussions later, perhaps if I do a video on the scholastic concepts of God, but suffice it to say that the Lutherans largely agree with those before them in terms of their descriptions of the divine nature, specifically affirming classical theism. Calov, however, has some unique philosophical contributions, at least according to the secondary sources that I've read. I haven't read any of Kalov's works directly because he's untranslated, but I have seen some interesting things from those describing his works. He predates Kant in putting a heavy emphasis on the structure of the mind and the mind's operation in metaphysical considerations. What's also interesting is that he moves the subject of ontology, a division of metaphysics, to the study of the knowable. Calov was overall very influenced by Suarez, and he also influenced Kant in some ways, or at least predated him. This doesn't mean that all of the Lutherans were like this, but it's nonetheless an interesting digression from the mean. And before we get comments about how this shows that Protestants caused modernism, please recall that Descartes, Malebranche, and others were not scholastics by any means, but they were Roman Catholic figures. I wouldn't actually use this argument against Rome, but I only mention it because the very annoying argument that Protestantism led to modernism is pretty popular among a bunch of Catholic apologists. With all this said, I don't want to leave us simply with a series of citations from various scholastics. Since the Lutherans haven't really done too much work on metaphysics, at least that's translated, I want to put out my own thoughts on this. I overall agree with the traditional Aristotelian scholastic view that metaphysics is the science of being, where the material object of metaphysics is all things, possible or actual, and the formal object of metaphysics is these objects under the aspect of being. I think Suarez is right, though, in defining metaphysics solely in terms of real being, which is both actual and potential being. I appreciate the Scotus contribution to metaphysics, focusing on transcendentals, because being is necessarily coextensive with truth, goodness, and unity, though there may be others. A successful study of metaphysics should lead to conclusions regarding the transcendentals, whether coextensive or disjunctive, as Scotus discusses in his works. I will return to this concept in the future, of course. So far, I should say that I disagree with Calov's system, but I haven't read him primarily because he's not in English, and I don't know other languages besides Spanish. I also don't think that he's a representative of Lutheran thought in this respect, and I certainly do not think that one must hold to his system to be Lutheran. I find a lot of atheists and agnostics saying that metaphysics is not a valid study. This is not representative of all atheists or agnostics by any means. Plenty of atheists use metaphysical studies to reach the conclusion that God does not exist, and they will openly say that these are metaphysical disputations and conclusions. So please don't say that atheism is necessarily opposed to metaphysical disputations, because there are plenty of atheists throughout history who've written such works. The same may be said for pantheists, panentheists, and other non-theists. Nonetheless, there's a crowd out there that believes that metaphysics is a useless discussion, both among Christians and non-Christians. I addressed this in the Prolegomena video to some extent, but I believe it'd be valuable to return this topic briefly and repeat what I said there, maybe add a little too. First, I argue from the truths concerning the subject matter. Sometimes I find that individuals are opposed to metaphysics on the ground that it has the name metaphysics, a name which has been unfortunately perverted by New Agers. When I walk into bookstores, I see the metaphysics section entirely full of tarot cards and advice and palm reading, alongside other complete nonsense. That, however, does not disqualify metaphysics as a valid study. As I've already said, metaphysics studies the nature of being and the first principles. These principles are true, whether we want to call them the study of metaphysics or the study of first principles. You can call it whatever you want, really, but these principles are real and necessary, so the study of them is important and valid. Who will deny that we must affirm basic laws of reality like the principle of non-contradiction or the principle of identity? Since these are true laws of reality, we necessarily yield that the study of them is valid as well. While other conclusions of metaphysics are more controversial, they nonetheless are valid for study. Therefore, the truth of some metaphysical conclusions necessarily entails that metaphysics in itself is a valid enterprise, however modest it may be. Second, I argue from a kind of grounding necessity. Other fields of study are necessarily grounded in principles of being, like the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity. Thus, if we deny these principles, we lose the possibility of other inquiry, which are necessary for basic human thought. For example, if we say that it's possible for water to simultaneously be H2O and not H2O on the basis of a denial of the principle of non-contradiction, we have entirely lost the ability to make conclusions regarding chemistry. This is not only performed in scientific fields, but in fields of basic human interaction. When my boss says, "Did you send me the email?" I can't say yes and no in the same respect. While I may not be actively recognizing the law of non-contradiction as an axiom and thus spending time contemplating it, it's nonetheless presupposed for my normal interactions. So thanks for watching. Now that we have described and defined metaphysics as a science, we can get into the actual content of metaphysical study. Stay tuned for those videos.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching another Scholastic Lutherans video. If you'd like to support us, you can follow us on Twitter at Gerhard's Ghost, or contribute on Patreon at Scholastic Lutherans. There you'll get access to our Telegram chat and other perks. Links can be found in the description. Subscribe, like, or leave a comment, and have a nice day.